Well, howdy, 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 everyone, and welcome back to the Rancher Podcast. I hope you all enjoyed my first ever episode on Yellowstone 1883 and the historical background that I gave you there. As promised, I'm working on producing a background for each of the episodes, and I'm going to focus on a specific topic or a place or a thing that occurs in that episode. And so today is the first episode's recap, and also we're going to be focusing on the area known as Hell's Half Acre because, of course, that plays an important role in this episode. And I know a lot of you guys want to hear about it because, as I mentioned in a previous episode, Hell's Half Acre has held the top position in the Texas State Historical Association's list of most searched items for the last few weeks. And I know it's because of Yellowstone 1883 and the excitement people have over the show, and they wanted to learn more about this storied part of Texas and Fort Worth history. So, really excited to get into that. Of course, we'll do the recap first and then talk a little bit more in depth about Hell's Half Acre, but we'll get into all of that right after a quick word from our sponsors. Well, episode one starts off pretty eventful, violent. A lot happens. Let's just say that. The first part, of course, is a flashback or flash forward, I guess, into the Dutton life when they finally get on the trail, and you see who is essentially considered the main character, Elsa Dutton, the daughter of James Dutton, who is running away from a burning wagon, shooting at the Indians that are in pursuit of her and the rest of the wagon train. And it's pretty gruesome. We see scalping, we see arrows being shot at fleeing women and children. Quite the tough beginning. And then, of course, the very next scene is Sam Elliott's character, whose name is Captain Shea Bratton. He is actually mourning the loss of both his, who it appears to be his wife and daughter, and he ends up burning his home to the ground and almost committing suicide until his good friend comes and stops him, whose name is Thomas, and they instead, I guess, decide that they're going to try and make the trip to Oregon. And so that's really an interesting beginning for Captain Brennan and Thomas, as well as the Dutton folks. So, of course, Taylor Sheridan's not somebody who does much subtlety. If you're a fan of Yellowstone, you know that he does not shy away from difficult and gruesome scenes. So I don't think that was much of a shock. But it's interesting that right as the action with these two circumstances ends, we get our first introduction to Tim McGraw's character, James Dutton, who's the patriarch of the Dutton family. And he is riding in a wagon trying to escape a bunch of thieves. He guns down quite a few of them without the help of Thomas and Captain Shea, as he's quick to point out when they come down the hill. But it's just a very action-packed first episode, and I'll talk a little bit later about some of the complaints I have about the show. None of them have to do with historical accuracy, but I can't deny that the first episode was very exciting and a lot of fun. And of course, the topic or the main point of today's episode is going to surround where James Dutton, is moving to next, and that is Hell's Half Acre in Fort Worth, because he's going to pick up his wife and his two children, and of course his sister-in-law and her and niece. So Pretty funny scene when he first gets into town. Of course, he says he's there to pick up his wife and children, and the guy he's going to store his wagon with says this is not a place for women and children. And you can really quickly get that scene or that sense because, first of all, he gets pickpocketed, has to shoot the man in the butt with a shotgun, who is then summarily strung up, and then his friends stop the stringing. And I mean, it's just a chaotic sequence as he moves into Hell's Half Acre. So, of course, we also see that they stay in a hotel there in Hell's Half Acre, which was one of the main draws. Of course, we'll get into more details about everything there, but there were places such as the White Elephant that were known for being, quite elegant and beautiful places for weary travelers to rest, kind of almost like a mirage in the middle of the desert. But they stay there, and then, of course, decide to help Shay and Thomas with the moving of a bunch of immigrants up the Oregon Trail. And I think James does this really because he understands the perils of the trip and understands that there is, of course, strength in numbers. So, that's just a bit of a recap of the episode. And like I said, I do want to mention a couple of things that I am not super happy about with the show. Of course, first one, I am a cord cutter. I don't watch live TV hardly at all, except for a few sporting events. And so I have not watched anything with this many commercials in a very long time, and it makes the show seem so much slower to me. Obviously, this isn't a complaint with the show itself, but man, I just feel like I can never actually get into an episode because every time something interesting is about to happen, there's, a few minutes of commercials. So very much looking forward to watching this show, binging it, if you will, in the future when I don't have to worry about commercials. But for now, I know it's a small complaint, and it's not even about 1883 or the content, but it feels like I can't ever get through an episode because they're so slow with all the commercials. The second part that I really am not a huge fan of is the voiceover. It comes from Elsa Dutton's character. I think that she's a very interesting character. I'm glad that she's the main character because obviously we're going to hopefully have a bridge from, the James Dutton, the Tim McGraw character to Elsa's generation down one more generation, hopefully with her children or, nieces, nephews, whoever it may be. I like that there's probably going to be some type of carryover there. But I just feel that Elsa has this very forced accent, and to have to sit there and listen to her do this voiceover in this, whispery, hammed up accent, I'm not a huge fan of because I find what she's saying to be very important and very insightful, but the delivery just makes me want to zone out because it's like you can tell something's off or fake or wrong about the accent. So those are my own complaints, but enough about that. Nobody came here to hear me complain about the show. But if you have your own opinions, I would love to hear them. Of course, I think so far the history has been very interesting. So let's get into, more information about where this episode took place, or at least a majority of it, and that is Hell's Half Acre. Now, I have actually unwittingly walked around Hell's Half Acre, and if you've been to downtown Fort Worth, you probably have too. Specifically, the convention center area is in, or partially in, Hell's Half Acre. So if you know Fort Worth well, you know that this is an area that's just kind of due south of the Sundance Square, the courthouse, all these kind of iconic areas, and it's a little bit more southeast of the Fort Worth Stockyards. So, but it is still downtown, and this area, I find it interesting that while tourists and folks from out of town are showing up to this place for all kinds of reasons like conventions and whatnot, Um, it's funny that this area, even back in the 19th century, was a economic driver for the city. Although be it in a different way, it brought entertainment value to the city, and that continues to resonate to this day. So I just found that to be kind of a funny or ironic thing that we're unwittingly walking around the entertainment district, if you will, today when we go to conventions and whatnot uh, in Fort Worth. So Hell's Half Acre was almost, more of a generic name. I got a lot of information from the Texas Historical Association's website because, of course, it has some of the best information. It is a great resource that I use for a lot of my podcasts, and I would encourage you to become a subscriber. You can get all kinds of great benefits, including their quarterly journal, and it's a great thing to spend your hard-earned money on. It's a great place to invest. So a lot of this information is going to come from the Texas State Historical Association, so I want to thank them. But they said that Hell's Half Acre was this really essentially a generic name for a red light district. So many of the towns in Texas, and they list San Antonio, Fort Worth, Tascosa. All these places had areas that were called red light districts, along with Webberville, which is somewhere outside of Austin. And this name was typically given to these areas by men who were coming back from the Civil War. These returning soldiers probably brought the fairies back, it says, because of the bloody battlefields that they had experienced or encountered when they were out east fighting. So typically, the name denoted that there would be prostitution in the area. Of course, along came with that was gambling and other vices. But the Fort Worth Hell's Half Acre was without a doubt the most famous one on the frontier. And, that came from the fact that it was definitely a stop on many of the cattle trails in the early 1870s. Fort Worth was kind of right, just as it is today, right smack dab in the middle of the country. And because of that, a lot of people were crossing through. And, it was quickly, although to this day is still smaller than its city next door, Dallas. It was quickly a growing destination, or at least somewhere to stop over on your trek from east to west, or west to east, or even north to south. So just as it is a travel destination today, or at least somewhere that you can access DFW Airport, Fort Worth and Dallas area has always been kind of a great place to stop over, if you will. And so in the 1870s, specifically 1874, a local newspaper first called this area of Fort Worth Hell's Half Acre. And, the iconic figures in the area were the brothels, the bordellos, as they would call them, the saloons, gambling parlors. All these things were brought up into the one small area. And although it's called Hell's Half Acre, it actually sprawled out to be much more than just half an acre. And it's interesting. One of the headlines says that they raised Mary Kane at the Waco Tap, which was one of the names of the saloons there in the area. And the Historical Association lists the following as things that you could find if you were to go into Hell's Half Acre. They included brawling, gambling, cockfighting, and horse racing. But of course, these were, we actually saw a horse race in the first episode of Yellowstone, 1883, as James Dutton walks into town. There's a couple of men racing their horses through the streets of Hell's Half Acre. So, I thought that was an interesting touch that they brought in, and of course, it has historical background as we hear here. But this area was growing in the 1880s, and it wasn't until the end of the 1880s that the reformers started to try and bring it to an end. So the fact that The Duttons would stop here during the year 1883. Completely makes sense. It was also where the railroad was going, and so I just want to make sure that you all understand that everything so far is checking out, if you will, in the show. I know that there's of course questions about the Oregon Trail and the immigrants and why they were in Texas and whatnot, but the portrayal of Hell's Half Acre is certainly a good one and a historically accurate one, if you ask me or you consult the literature that is prevailing today. So the area was the lower end of Rusk Street, which is now Commerce Street. And if you know, again, Fort Worth downtown area very well, you'll know that that area is what runs into Sundance Square. So very cool part of town today. And back then, of course, being near the river, it was highly sought after. And as I mentioned earlier, this was much more than a half acre. In 1881, one of the local papers, the Fort Worth Democrat, said that it was actually more than 2.5 acres and was growing across 4 of the city's main north to south streets, which included, of course, Main, Rusk, which is also Commerce, Calhoun, and Jones streets. And it covered 7th Street down to 5th Street, which was the Union Station. So again, I remember when I've driven through the Fort Worth area many a times, you'll see this beautiful, very old train station near the south end of downtown, and again, that's where Hell's Half Acre was. So I would encourage you to pull it up on a map and compare it with, if you look up the convention center down to the train station, that'll give you a pretty good idea of how big this area was and what it encompassed in Fort Worth. So another name that Hell's Half Acre had was actually the Bloody Third Ward, which people, we don't necessarily use this language too much today. Of course, during the flooding from Hurricane Katrina, there was all talks about all kinds of wards in the city of New Orleans, but there were 3 political wards in Fort Worth. And so this one was the Third Ward, and they thus called it the Bloody Third Ward. Now, there were a lot of interesting things going on in the 1880s in this area. As I mentioned, the people in the area, the reformers, didn't really get started trying to curtail the violence of this area until the 1890s into the early 1900s. So throughout the 1880s and 90s, you actually saw the gunmen, the card sharks, the con men, all these people were, coming into this area to, I guess, ply their trades, if you will. And so it wasn't until a few years later when men like H.S. Broyles, who was the mayor, and newspaper editors like B.B. Paddock declared war on this area. But even then, there weren't really very good, successful long-term results. It really took the general will of the public to settle the city of Fort Worth to really bring this area to its knees. But there was a lot of issues bringing it down, because this was a economic driver, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, people were coming to Fort Worth to spend the night here, enjoy themselves, what have you, and they were spending money. So it's one of those things where it's not in the best interest, especially of the local population sometimes, to shut something like this down, because it is a money-making, venture that's driving money into your city. And if you're going to cut that off, it's going to cost people their jobs. And while there's certainly a public safety aspect to this, you always have to understand that politicians of the time had to measure the will of the voters. And sometimes when it comes to taking away jobs, it's not a very successful, successful campaign strategy, if you will. So, one of the interesting things was that, it was known as the Bloody Third Ward because of obviously the gun battles and the murders and whatnot. But apparently, suicide was also a very large issue in the area. Of course, that comes along with alcohol abuse, thievery, all these things. So it was really just a dark area in town. And finally, what was funny was one of the things that really led to the largest outcries is that there were dance halls, and people were very concerned that the dance halls were leading to the moral degradation of the people of Fort Worth because men and women were meeting up and dancing. So, they didn't mind the gambling, they didn't mind the saloons because those were basically all men, and it was kind of considered an area for men to blow off steam, if you will. But when it turned out that women were getting involved and going of their own free will to go dancing, that's what That's what really made the public decide they did not like the area, and came about to try and stop it. So one of the major reform campaigns was in the late 1880s, like I said, by Mayor Boyles. And the first event that was really the catalyst for this was in February of 1887. Luke Short and Jim Courtright had a shootout on Main Street that left Courtright, who was, one of the leading lawmen in the area, and then of course Short, who was the king of Fort Worth gamblers, injured. So Courtright was dead, Short was injured, and although the fight did not occur in the acre, it focused the city's public attention on this area again. A few weeks later, a prostitute known only by the name of Sally was found murdered and nailed to an outhouse door in the acre. So, just absolutely a gruesome and gross place. And, because of these two things, and prohibition coming to Texas, the acre was really shutting down by 1889, 1890. So, again, the interesting part that the Historical Association talks about is that as new businesses and homes moved into this area, there was a major change in the clientele that were coming in. One of the interesting changes was the influx of black residents into the area. And while they had been excluded from business all over town, they were actually able to build up a successful population of about 50,000 by 1900, or 7,000 out of the 50,000 in Fort Worth in 1900. And because of that, they began to build their own businesses in the area. One of the ones that I thought was pretty funny is there was a famous saloon in Hell's Half Acre that was known as the White Elephant. And when this influx of African Americans occurred, they founded their own successful saloon known as the Black Elephant. So, of course, some great enterprising and entrepreneurial folks were able to be successful. But when this happened, as these families and whatnot moved in, the desire for an entertainment district began to wane. And of course, there was not as many people, such as cowboys, driving through the area because of the residential, development. So those were kind of the big things that drove the end of Hell's Half Acre. And then in 1911, Reverend J. Frank Norris launched a very offensive campaign against racetrack gambling, and prostitution, other vices. So under his leadership from the pulpit, as it said, they were successful in kind of shutting the area down, but that was not without its own dangers. On February 4th, 1912, his church, Norris's church, was burned to the ground as a bunch of men threw burning oiled rags into it, along with onto his porch of his home. But fortunately, that one was extinguished. So, very, very heated times. Again, this was the livelihood for a lot of people. And, these attacks and whatnot continued until 1917. And then finally, in the end of 1919, 1920, I mean, you had the First World War, the Roaring Twenties. I mean, Prohibition, all these things were kind of making it harder and harder for an area like this to survive. So, that's kind of the story of the Hell's Half Acre, if you will. And I hope that you'll go and read more about it. Like I said, from TSHA. If you haven't already, it's a great story. And, what I find most interesting about Yellowstone 1883 is that they're taking very specific parts of American history, specific places like Hell's Half Acre, and weaving them into quite the interesting story. As I've mentioned, the details they play fast and loose with, but I think that this is going to be a very uniquely American story. Obviously, if you are listening to this, more than just the first episode has come out already. And there's other details that have come along. Obviously, timeline is not necessarily the most accurate of things, but overall, I'm just so thankful to Taylor Sheridan for deciding to tell this story, because we're getting to see a lot of very cool history that's not necessarily covered. Again, like I said, all these people are Googling Hell's Half Acre because it's not necessarily a place that many people know about. I remember when the HBO series Watchmen came out and they covered the Tulsa race riots. That was the first time a lot of people had heard about the Tulsa race riots. Of course, me growing up in Oklahoma, I had learned about it in our state history, but I think that that's one of the great parts of not just 1883, but of serial television culture, especially one that covers history, is that you're bringing a whole new generation of viewers to historical information. And of course, that's why I'm decided to do this new series on my podcast, is because I want to be able to give resources and more information about what's going on so that you can better understand it. If you will, it's essentially a spark notes to the show. I can give you a little bit more detail and background as to what's going on. So I hope you enjoy the series. I hope you're enjoying 1883. I wish I could just binge them all, like I said, without commercials. It's a fascinating story. I know that it's been a little spotty on when episodes are coming out, but I think it's been worth it. And of course, the longer they string it out, the less time we have to wait between this and the next season of Yellowstone, or the 4/6's spinoff that's coming. Allegedly, I hear that it's coming, and it apparently seems so, but I don't know when that will occur. So really excited about the future of this series and the others. And if you ever have any questions about the series or any of the history in it, I might not be able to answer it, but I can certainly refer you to websites or other people who can. And if you ever have any thoughts, suggestions, inputs, anything historical that you pick up on in an episode that you want to point out to me that I can cover on this, I would be greatly appreciative of that. So thank you again for listening. And of course, until next time, Godspeed and God bless.